Hi, I'm Josh Rushing, and you're in the stream. Today, hate speech, censorship, and anti-Semitism, all being reported at University of California schools. We look at the tensions between Palestinian solidarity groups and certain Jewish organizations on campus. Our digital producer, Malika Blau, is here looking out for your live feedback. Malika, I know this is always a hot one for our community, so what are they saying?
It definitely is. Well, a majority of our community are saying that universities shouldn't restrict speech on their campuses, but then we got a handful of tweets, like this one from Brown, who says, there is a limitation to everything. What do you call that kind of freedom of speech that ends up hurting others? Now, for those of you at home, we'd like you to join the conversation and let us know what you think. Use the hashtag AJStream.
Great. Joining Malika and myself is Kenneth Marcus, President and General Counsel at the Louis D. Brandeis Center, which focuses on civil and human rights of the Jewish people. Kenneth, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing attention to the problem of campus anti-Semitism.
Should be a good discussion. We're also interested to hear from our panel in the Google Plus Hangout. They all attend UC schools and are ready to discuss the atmosphere on their campuses. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Now, if you want to join a future Hangout just like this, add us to your circles on Google+. The URL is at the bottom of your screen right there, and you could be in the stream.
Hi, I'm Omar Tawfiq, and I work on media relations and communications and Middle East issues. Care about a lot of different things, including soccer, fashion, and food, and I'm in the stream.
University of California campuses are known to be hotspots for debate and tension surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This has been on the rise in the past few years, culminating in legal action, accusations of hate speech, and what some view as censorship. Recently, the California Assembly passed Resolution H.R. 35, which tackles the issue of anti-Semitism on campuses. Have a listen.
This resolution calls on the leaders of California colleges and universities to take action to address anti-Semitic actions on campuses. The resolution also specifies that public resources shouldn't be used for intolerant agitation and the promotion of anti-Semitic ideology. Free speech is specifically designed for politically objectionable speech. And had those who instigated these incidents on California campuses limited themselves to free speech, this wouldn't be an issue.
Of course, not everyone agrees with the Assemblywoman there. There are many critics of this resolution, interpreting the language to mean that even peaceful university protest against specific Israeli government policies should be prohibited. Ongoing petitions against H.R. 35 claims this limits free speech and is an attempt to silence Palestinian solidarity activism. So, do universities have the right to curb freedom of speech? And what exactly constitutes anti-Semitism? Joining us via Skype from Oakland, California is Nora Barrows-Friedman, writer and editor with Electronic Intifada. She's been reporting on events surrounding the situation at UC campuses. Welcome back to the stream, Nora.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Now, we want to mention here that we did reach out to the Office of the President of the University of California, Mark Yudof, but they declined to comment. Great. Kenneth, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in California and why this seems to be happening in California? Is this a bellwether for the rest of the United States?
Sure. I wish it weren't, but the fact is that in so many areas we find that what happens first in California happens in the rest of the country too. We've been seeing for about 12 years a resurgence of that old prejudice, anti-Semitism. Starting at Irvine and Berkeley and then throughout the system, we hear students saying things like F the Jews and dirty Jews and go back to Russia and Hitler should have finished the job and Jews should be finished off in the ovens and slaughter the Jews and kill the Jews. And not just speech, but also destruction of a Holocaust monument, at least allegedly, some physical assault and battery. And
is there a quantitative way to show if those numbers are going up or down? Are they tracked in that kind of way?
They're not tracked very well, and I think that this is a problem not just for anti-Semitism, but all forms of bias. We do a very poor job of tracking bias and hate in higher education. There are figures showing that there have been between 80 and 100 or 120 anti-Semitic incidents in universities around the country each year. I think that figure is very low. The problem is that nobody is under any sort of duty to report anti-Semitic incidents, and I believe that most incidents go unreported. Same is true for other forms of hate and bias.
Nora, you're out there reporting on this. Is anti-Semitism on the rise in University of California campuses?
Actually, I very much disagree with Mr. Marcus's assessment. According to extensive data on this subject, it has been shown that Jewish students are overwhelmingly having a positive experience on campuses across California and across the nation. And I think it's only because people like Mr. Marcus and groups that are aligned with the Israeli government and Israeli policy have been on a crusade to conflate Israeli policies, criticism of Israeli policies, with this definition of anti-Semitism that has nothing to do with bigotry against Jews. I think it's extremely dangerous for people like Mr. Marcus and these groups who are aligned with Israel to say that criticism of Israeli policy and standing up for Palestinian human rights is equated as a form of anti-Semitism. So I think it sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's actually pretty offensive to me as a Jewish American, and to many Jews who are involved with the Palestinian Solidarity Movement and the Palestine Solidarity activism movement on campuses, to be lumped in with someone else's definition of who Jews are, what they stand for, and somehow how we're all made out to be a vulnerable population on UC campuses.
Our community is weighing in here on the central premise of today's show, which is whether or not universities have the right to limit speech. Robert says no, universities are supposed to encourage discussion on all issues and nothing should be off limits. On the other hand, you have Mikey, who says universities have the obligation to limit free speech if it threatens the lives and the educational experience of its students. And so with that, I want to go to one of those students and ask that very question. Rebecca Pierce is at UCSC, She's a film and digital media student. Rebecca, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Mr. Marcus if he thought that for the Jewish students, the growing number of Jewish students who participate in things like Israel Apartheid Week and BDS, do we have a place in the Jewish community? Because the definition of anti-Semitism that you've been promoting seems to really cut us out and silence us.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there are many different ways of expressing Jewish identity, and that there's no single person or organization who should be defining it. So whatever your politics, whatever your point of view, that doesn't exclude you from the Jewish community. I think I need at least briefly to say, in response to an earlier remark, I'm not aligned with the state of Israel, as one of the prior speakers said. Mm-hmm. And I agree with an earlier speaker who said that for Jewish students, this is an overwhelmingly positive time. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, this is a great time to be Jewish on American college campuses, but that doesn't mean that we can be anything less than vigilant when we see hateful incidents aimed at some Jewish students. So
there's a movement across college campuses in the U.S. called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, where it wants universities to pull out their funds from any company that supports the government of Israel. It is set up off the example of how apartheid was challenged in the same way in the 1980s with South Africa. Is political involvement in BDS in itself anti-Semitic in your view?
Well, I'm on record as saying that that movement is not a civil rights violation in any way in and of itself. Now, you ask, is it anti-Semitic? I don't think that movement per se is anti-Semitic. However, there are certainly many different BDS activities where we see people expressing anti-Semitic views in the course of being active in the BDS movement. I don't think one should necessarily paint with a broad brush and criticize everybody as anti-Semitic who's involved in the movement, but I think that it is significant that you are seeing an uptick in anti-Semitism that has corresponded with the rise of that movement.
Nora, let me ask you, are people who are involved in the BDS movement with Israel in California, are they threatened by stuff like HR 56?
HR 35.
Sorry, HR 35. Let me correct that before you start.
HR 35 was a resolution that was passed several months ago by the California State Assembly. And basically what it does is it calls on university administrations to restrict the free speech rights of students and faculty, and once again conflates criticism of Israeli policy with anti-Semitism. This was a shock to many students and to many faculty and people in the civil rights community, because it sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's asking for legislative backing to really clamp down on free speech and to censor Palestine solidarity activism on campus. Universities, especially the University of California system, are bastions of free thought and debate and discussion and open-mindedness and learning and education about all sorts of people, all sorts of issues. And to have this politically motivated piece of legislation, in the form of this resolution, calling on universities to restrict those rights is extremely terrifying.
Our community is weighing in now on what the difference between anti-Semitic speech and anti-Israel speech is. Ahmed says, thousands of Jews are anti-Israeli/Zionist. What are they? Self-hating. Another tweet from Rama who says, if one criticizes Saudi Arabia for its human rights violations, does that make one Islamophobic? I want to pose this question to Hannah Barkodari, who's in UCLA, a grad student there. Hannah, what is the distinction between those two things?
Thank you so much for having me here. And I just want to point out that, yes, there is anti-Semitic remarks that are cloaked as anti-Zionist. And you have, for example, flyers going around of Netanyahu as Hitler, and these caricatures and the demonization of Israel that occurs, and movements that do target Israel in a way that is not only demonizing but delegitimizes its right to exist as a state, and that holds it to a double standard that any other country wouldn't be held, is anti-Semitic. You have to protect freedom for students concerning all rights and matters and as they stand in all cases, but you cannot allow those tactics to be so virulent that they verge on anti-Semitism. So the real question is, how do we curtail that? How do we curtail those actions such as the BDS movement and their constituents, which really rise from the idea that Israel should not exist as a state and come from that angle?
Hey, are you saying there that there should be legislation that should curtail the actions of the BDS movement? Should the BDS movement be allowed on UC campuses?
The right to protest and the right to say, we want to be able to provide this as a view that there should be sanctions on a certain country for a certain action is one thing, but to have academic boycotts, to have boycotts of anything Israeli simply because it's Israeli, those things are not legitimate. And the actual origins of BDS rise from, in 2005, the organization by Arafat that wanted to start the Second Intifada. It was a component of the Intifada. So having that root, that basis, which a lot of the founders of BDS very openly say has the goal of destroying Israel, that doesn't seem to me like simply political protest.
Well, Hannah, I want to ask you, though, I get that you don't think it's legitimate, but what I want to know is, do you think that it should be disallowed from UC campuses?
I mean, HR 35 did not disallow it as a way of expressing itself legally. It just said that the anti-Semitic components of it should be curtailed. So again, you have to look at the distinctions. You have to look at what is the ultimate goal here. And if the goal is simply a protest of a certain company that has a certain tie to, a certain thing that is, let's say, terrorism, etc., that's different. But to say that we're part of a global movement that wants a one-state solution, a dissolution of Israel, that is not legitimate.
Kenneth, I think some of this, and it came up from our community, becomes confusing when what is anti-Semitic and what is Israel, and how do you separate the two? And I've read a number of articles that you've written, and you bring up the idea of political anti-Semitism. Can you explain what you mean by political anti-Semitism?
Sure. We know that over the last several decades, people have been less open about their racism. Half a century ago, people might have said things about black people that they wouldn't say in polite company today. Same is true of Jews, same is true of Arabs and Muslims and other groups. People often don't say what they mean. Oftentimes they cloak their racism in other terms. So in some cases one will see classic anti-Semitic motifs, but instead of actually talking about Jews, you'll talk about Zionists or about Israel. And yet you'll do it in exactly the same way that people have been talking about Jews for hundreds of years. Now, I don't think that anti-Semitism should be banned legally. It's one thing to say it's anti-Semitic and a very different thing to say that there should be some legal barrier or some punishment or prohibition. But if something is anti-Semitic and not just political, I think we need to know that difference, and I think we need to be clear about it.
It seems to muddle the two, anti-Semitism and anti-Israel. For example, is it anti-Semitic to compare what's happening in Israel today with the apartheid, like Jimmy Carter did in his book?
Well, there are two different questions. One is Jimmy Carter, and the other is the more general question. I haven't read Jimmy Carter's book. I know that there are many close readings of his book that argue that it is anti-Semitic.
But you believe he's you believe that Carter is anti-Semite?
I would not say that. And generally speaking, I prefer not to say that individuals are anti-Semitic because I think that it's counterproductive. What I prefer to do is to look at certain tropes or memes, certain ways of speaking, and to ask the question, whether you mean to be anti-Semitic or not, are you conveying a classic kind of Jew hatred intentionally or not? And some of this political discourse does that, whether the speakers mean to or not.
Well, I don't want to get wrapped around Carter because that's not new, but you have called him anti-Semitic on your Twitter on a number of occasions.
I have?
Yeah, you said, I have your Twitter account pulled up here, we can show it to our audience, but is Jimmy Carter selling out his anti-Semitic principles to advance his grandson's political career? Is a tweet from you. Another tweet is, in the spirit of Christmas, I would like to apologize for stigmatizing Jimmy Carter, unless perhaps this is not your account and this is someone else's account, which could literally be the case. I can show you my laptop. Is this your account, or is this someone that has perhaps posed as you?
I would like to apologize for stigmatizing.
Used a picture.
Well, this is my picture, but I don't recall this tweet.
That
I would
tweet
like
or
to apologize
this
for including my book, Carter, please. Okay, I'm sorry, I just don't
this
recall.
tweet either?
Selling out to advance his grandson's. The date of it is 2009. I don't recall that.
Okay, all right. Our community, let's bring them back into the discussion.
Let's get our community in. Let's go straight to Google Hangout with Rahim. Rahim Korwaz at UCLA. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's important to sort of explain what's actually being proposed here, both in HR 35 and in the campus climate reports, which actually talk about effectively creating two classes of citizens at the UC. One group who will be exposed to all kinds of monitoring and limitations on their speech, while everybody else on campus who speaks about any other topics wouldn't be exposed to those kinds of monitoring. And I think that like any way that these policies would be implemented would effectively turn us into second-class citizens. And I think that's a real shame at the university system that was known for creating the free speech movement in the first place.
Does this issue need additional monitoring as opposed to any other minority group like gays, Hispanics, African Americans?
I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization. As I read the campus climate report at the UC, it calls for banning hate speech of all kinds, not just against Jews, but against all minority groups. I happen to disagree with that recommendation. I don't think that hate speech should be banned, and I think it would be unconstitutional to do so. But it's not just about one particular group.
Well, HR 35 was just about one particular group, right?
HR 35 was. Now, I think HR 35 is an excellent piece of non-binding legislation. Unfortunately, I think all of the good aspects of HR 35 have been ignored, and the one part that people focus on is the one part that I disagree with, which is the notion that there should be some sort of prohibition on speech. That's always been a non-starter because, as we know, the president of the University of California is a First Amendment scholar who's very strong on speech. So I don't think anyone really needs to be worried about the University of California cracking down on free speech. What I do think we need to worry about is the University of California ignoring the anti-Semitism which is going on many of its campuses.
Nora, is it about cracking down on free speech, or even without cracking down on free speech, does it create a chilling effect when trying to discuss this subject?
Absolutely. And I do have to point out that Mr. Marcus has been a pioneer of trying to criminalize Palestine solidarity activism and criticism of Israeli policy at the highest levels. He has been the architect of using the very precious 1964 Civil Rights Act and using Title VI of that Civil Rights Act to be used as a battering ram in which to say that some Jewish students on university campuses are being, quote, discriminated against because of Palestine solidarity activism, because of BDS, because of open criticism and discussion about Israeli policy. And that, I think, is even more chilling than the HR 35 resolution, which is a non-binding resolution. But it's also important to point out that every time that Mr. Marcus and people who have followed suit has taken these Title VI claims to the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, they have failed. Or they are still pending after years and years of being, at the Department of Education. And I think that also this tactic has been rejected by many groups who are aligned with Israel, who are saying that Mr. Marcus's tactics here of using the 1964 Civil Rights Act in this manner is considered extreme. And there are discussions within the Zionist community about how this type of intimidation and legal threats has no place in trying to protect Jewish students and Jews in the U.S.
All right, I know you're dying to respond to that. Can you begin, though, just with a brief explanation? She brings up Title VI. A lot of our audience doesn't know what Title VI is. I know you used to hold a post at the Department of Justice, and you were involved in changing Title VI. So if you can explain that and then respond as you like.
The Department of Education. Yeah, I think that's all nonsense. I don't know who this speaker is from the Electronic Intifada, but pretty much everything she said, I think, is nonsense.
Like specifically, what's nonsense?
Well, first, that I'm trying to criminalize anything. To start with, I say very little about criminal law, although if people are subject to assault and battery, I think it should generally be prosecuted. But this notion of criminalization is total nonsense. I'm also not interested in punishing or restricting speech. That's also manufactured. Title VI is a civil rights statute. It's part of the 1964 statute that was created to desegregate the schools and to reverse the horrors of Jim Crow and the segregation of black Americans, but it also applies to many other groups. Basically, it says that an institution like a public school or a university that receives federal funds can't discriminate on certain bases, like race, color, national origin. When I was the head of the Office for Civil Rights in 2004, I issued a policy clarification which essentially said that Jews are entitled to the protection of this statute. Arab Muslims are entitled to it, Sikhs are entitled to it. Even though they're a religious group and not just a racial group, these groups that hadn't previously been protected deserve the same protection of the laws. So that was the clarification.
What's been the effect of that? Have there been any cases that have come forward and I guess where that change has affected those cases?
There have been a handful of cases that have been brought, and almost all of them are still pending. One of them was rejected basically when the Office for Civil Rights says there's a he says, she says, and we can't resolve the disputed testimony, but all of the rest of them are still being investigated. One of them was partly rejected, and it's under appeal within the department.
Okay.
So for the last several years, OCR has had these cases, it's been investigating them, and they're still ongoing.
Okay, all right, so we're under a minute on the show here. So what I want you to do right now, if you're watching, go to your computers and go to stream.aljazeera.com, because there's a lot more in this conversation to come. I mean, we've really just got started here. So go to Al Jazeera or stream.aljazeera.com and follow along. Then on Tuesday, we turn to Iraq, where waves of protests against the government have many predicting an Iraq spring. Will al-Maliki step down, or will early elections resolve the crisis? And until then, we'll see you online. Back to the Streams Post show. We're still looking at accusations of anti-Semitism, hate speech, and limitations on freedom of speech at the University of California campuses. Now with us are Ken Marcus, Nora Barrows-Friedman, and our Google Hangout panel. Let's go back to the panel, Malika.
Let's go to the panel. Before we do, though, there's some interesting viewpoints from our community members online. Here's a video comment left by one member. Just have a listen.
My name's Jessica Falk. I'm the president of the Jewish Society at Kingston University in London. There are absolutely no tensions between the Jewish Society and the Palestine Society here at Kingston. Last year I was actually a committee member of the Palestine Society and have continued to work closely with the Palestine Society this year to ensure that no tensions do arise between our students. And we're actually looking into holding a couple of coexistence events next year.
No tensions there, but then we got this Facebook comment from Sujaya, who says, anti-Semitism is a serious accusation, and indeed the safety and well-being of Jewish students is paramount. But addressing legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism should not come at the expense of Arab and Muslim students' right to free speech. So with that, I'd like to turn to Suleiman Houdali, who's in our Hangout, speaking to us from UCLA. Suleiman, what have you seen? Do you find Muslim and Arab students on campus intimidated?
Oh, well, I see a lot of attacks anytime there are events that organized by Palestine solidarity activists, and we're called all sorts of obscene names. And I think it's not a matter of censoring speech, they're interested in censoring ideas. These kinds of actions by California legislative bodies, UC administration officials, and organizations external to the university, like AMCHA Initiative, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Stand With Us, are targeting this BDS movement for the sole purpose of stifling that movement. Anyone familiar with the role of the UC system in divesting from South Africa in the 1980s knows the power of such as nonviolent democratic movement, and to see it pick up the momentum that it has in the past few years, I think signals a threat to those defenders of Israel who are opposed to Palestinian human rights.
Nora, I wonder if you can pick up on this. Have there been specific examples, or could you share with our audience specific examples of times when students have been punished for participating in maybe an SJP event?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of this slow, steady trickle of intimidation and threats that students feel. There have been many incidents. I've spoken with civil rights activists and attorneys who have said that Palestinian and Muslim and Arab students across the UC have been told by their family members not to join any activism groups or even the Muslim student associations because they fear that their record would be tarnished. There are many students inside these Palestine solidarity organizations who are intimidated by the legal threats that could arise. And who are afraid to speak up publicly about their views.
Nora, as an example of that,
on the other side,
can you give some details about the Irvine 11 case? I have a quote that I want to go to, but I'd like for you to set this up for me. For our audience who isn't familiar with Irvine 11, can you tell us what happened there?
Absolutely. I mean, this is what I was going to allude to, is that about 2 years ago, students, Muslim students at the University of Irvine in Southern California, vocally protested a speech given by an Israeli ambassador, who would come to the university specifically to defend Israel's policies during the 2008-2009 attacks, which killed about 1,400 people, including 300 children. Many of these students who stood up and protested Michael Oren's speech had family members and friends who were killed in these attacks. And they exercised their fundamental right to free speech by protesting this speech that was given. Not only were they arrested by security and led out of the room, but then the University of California punished them. They were given a year's probation for the Muslim Student Union, and then above and beyond that, outside of the jurisdiction of the university, the Orange County District Attorney's Office decided to launch criminal procedures against these kids. And that culminated in a criminal. They were criminally convicted and sentenced in September of 2011.
Well, Nora, we spoke to Reem Slahit, an attorney for some of those students. She told us about the effect the case has had on the activist community at UC campuses.
because of its unique nature, because it is somewhat discretionary, and because there's prosecutorial discretion, students and activists are a lot more chilled. And I've definitely seen a hike in individuals asking me before they might go protest outside of a forum or hold up signs at an event, whether they might be prosecuted, and that's very. That's very upsetting that would be the case, that students would have to now think twice before doing something that they should be permitted to do under the First Amendment.
So you have Palestinian students and groups saying that they feel a chilling effect from what's going on at the University of California campuses, but Jewish students are saying the same thing. Hannah, are you still there in the Google Plus Hangout?
Yes, I'm here.
I'm curious, do you feel more pressure from the opinions of your peers and other students and student groups, or from professors who are presenting the information in classrooms?
I've definitely always felt more pressure from the student groups themselves, but I think you see with HR 35 that it actually opened up this sort of can of worms where they were able to go to the UCSA and have a resolution passed through lobbying that basically does support BDS. And that kind of extreme political stance that student association took on behalf of all of the UCs, where it had really no right to sort of overstep its bounds in that regard, it made the Jewish community at large and other communities that disagreed with that stance really feel alienated. And I think silencing them is also dangerous. So universities should be providing for that free speech in all accounts, on all occasions.
I know that you were shaking your head during some of that. What was your take on the Irvine 11 and the way that's being interpreted?
Well, that is a free speech case in a sense. The Israeli ambassador was trying to speak, and there were at least 11 people who were trying to prevent him from speaking, joined by members of the audience. They tried to prevent him from speaking by standing up while he was talking and yelling and preventing him from talking. This is not a Title VI case. It's not an anti-Semitism case. These kids were prosecuted for the misdemeanor of something like disturbing the peace because they prevented an invited speaker from giving his speech. People who care about freedom of speech, I think, should say, you know what, people who want to give a lecture that's pro-Palestinian should be able to give a lecture that's pro-Palestinian, but if they want to give a lecture that's pro-Israeli, they should be able to do that too. The Irvine 11 case was about a group of students who tried to prevent a speaker from speaking, and they did it in a way that apparently violated a California misdemeanor law having to do with something like disturbing the peace.
So Malika, after 30 minutes of talking about this, do we change any minds on the internet? Which way do you see more communities going?
I don't know if we've changed minds, but we've definitely heated up passions.
Yeah.
Gabby here says, HR 35 builds paranoia for Jewish students. If all anti-Israel speech is anti-Semitic, it's harder to fight real anti-Semitism. And Rebecca, in our Google Plus Hangout, I want to go to you with this one. Would you agree with that statement?
I don't think that it's fair to say that all Jewish students feel the same way about criticism of Israel or feel threatened by it. A lot of us are engaging in that same criticism, and it's actually a growing number of us. So I think that the representation that this is a threat to us is really, maybe some students feel threatened, but certainly not all of us, or even a large majority, I would say.
But specifically to this tweet, she says, this makes it harder to fight real anti-Semitism. Real, of course, being Gabby's, right.
I think a good example would be, as a Jewish student at UC Santa Cruz, I've seen swastikas and things like that on campus that really disturbed me. And if the assumption, which is made in a lot of the climate report in HR 35, is that pro-Palestinian student groups are responsible for this, I'm actually getting blamed for hate crimes that target me. And so the people who are actually committing them are getting off scot-free while we're sort of being assumed to be guilty. I think that's a huge problem.
I think that's a problem no matter what minority group you're in, right? All right, great. Well, thanks to our guests for joining us. On Tuesday, we turn to Iraq, where waves of protest against the government have many predicting an Iraq Spring. Will al-Maliki step down, or will early elections resolve the crisis? And until then, we'll see you online.